The Experience of Thinking. A series of talks on change of consciousness in the writings of European philosophers by John Thompson. Episode 2. Aristotle.
Philosophy really begins with the Greeks. And before Plato, there were a number of Greek thinkers, and in a way their task was to move out of a previous understanding of the world and way of looking at the world into something that we call thinking. And that took the form of, if we look at the world, we see it's diverse in every way, the plant life, the mineral existence, the animals, human consciousness, and so on. It's an incredibly diverse world, full of variety and difference, and always moving, always changing. But everything seems in some way connected. Everything is connected. I see the pavement is drying, and I see that's connected with the sunlight coming out, and so on. Everything is interconnected, as well as everything shows difference, endurance and change, and so on. And so they asked themselves, there must be a prime binder to all this. What is that? And so these various pre-Plato philosophers were wrestling with that. One, like Heraclitus, emphasized the whole change that is essential to our understanding of the world and ourselves. And he said, one of his famous sayings is, you never put your foot in the same river twice. And his binding element was fire. Then you get another philosopher who will say it's air. Another one would say it's water. And so that was the disposition of thinking before Plato arrives on the scene. Now, Plato really experiences two main sources of his thinking. One was his teacher, Socrates. A word about him. I just want to recap this a little bit so that you understand the difference that we're going to meet in Aristotle. His master, Socrates, was not an academic in any sense. He didn't come out of the mystery schools. He was from a very humble background. And his approach to thinking was what we would call the dialogue. So he would meet people in the marketplace, or while he's walking to a little village somewhere, he meets somebody and asks him what he's doing. And the man would say, oh, I'm going to the courts. Oh, why are you going to the courts? I'm going to see justice done. Oh, that's interesting. Tell me, what is justice? So the man naively tries to undertake this problem. And then through dialogue, it's not through he's got a new theory he's going to implant in this person, this poor individual who's volunteered what he's up to, but he suddenly realizes that he's got a very naive and traditional view of what justice is. Socrates, to waken up people, to get out of their traditional habitual opinions and understand what thinking is. And Plato was very influenced by this individual. He revealed his teaching in dialogues, and the central figure in most of these dialogues is Socrates, who, like that, challenges people on the question of what is love, what is justice, what is virtue, and so on. And out of that, he builds his whole structure. Now, there's another element that plays very strongly into the philosophy of Plato, and that is the mystery centers were very important in the history of Greece, and they were in certain places. There was one in outside Athens, Eleusis. There was one up in the north in Samothrace. There was one in Delos and the island, and so on. There were various of these mystery centers, and that was the schooling, you might say, of those who wish to elevate their ability to enter into what is the world, what is the human being. And one of the temples, the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, there was written the word, know thyself. Know thyself. That was the task of these mystery centers, to help people to enter into the mystery of the hidden world. So it was a training which used the myths as a guidance, as a key element in bringing about this inner awakening. That still plays into the way Plato looks at the world. So these two elements are there. Now, I'll just mention this. I can't go into all the elements of Plato's philosophy. There's one thing I want to remind you about, and that is they talk much about Plato's theory of forms. Now, that needs a little bit of explanation. For us, a theory is some kind of position which is not necessarily the same as the reality. So that's only a theory, means there's another reality, often. But it didn't mean that in Greek. Theoria in Greek means contemplation. It's a contemplative exercise towards the understanding of forms. Now, that's another problem for us, because forms in the Greek understanding, in Plato it's idea, which you have as idea, and sometimes it's related as idea, but it's not quite equivalent to our idea of an idea. It's something slightly different, and importantly different. He's talking then about the contemplation that leads us into the world of form. Now, the world of form is the unchanging, unalterable, true, permanent reality. Into the world, we have the shadows of the sense world. And these are shadows of the form world. So that behind every object that we see, a horse, a star, whatever, a cabbage, there is an invisible form. And what we are seeing is its shadow. And for simple people like us, Plato tried to give an illustration of what he means. And I'll repeat that. It's called the story of the cave. So you imagine we're all sitting in a cave. There's a fire behind us. And that fire, everything that's here, all the things that we're sitting with, are being reflected on a wall. And so we're looking at the shadows on the wall and say, oh, that's the real world. But we're chained in one direction. We can't turn around because we're all chained. But there's some brave individuals who manage to break the chains and turn around. And they walk out of the cave, and there they come into the sunlight. And they see another world. But the sun is so bright that for many of them, they can hardly see it. So they rely on geometry, mathematics, and so on to give them some guidance in this new sunlit world. And then the stronger characters begin to see the reality, which is only shadowed for the people whom they've just left behind. And so you have 4 stages of perception. The ones who just watch the shadows are just living in conjectures. Then some of them are beginning to see, there's patterns in these shadows. There must be something behind that. And so Plato calls these people who are living in a certain belief. But they cross a dividing line when they break the chain and turn around and walk into the area of the sun. And that's a mythical presentation of the sun. What is the sun? And there you get the people who have, up to a certain extent, the geometers and the mathematicians who see there are geometrical connections between everything in the world and so on, and they see a certain amount. So they have a certain imagination of what the real world is, and there are finally those who are fully enlightened and realize and perceive the world of forms. Aristotle wasn't an Athenian. He was born in a place in northeast Greece, in the region of Samothrace. Now, Samothrace also had a mystery center where very important people were initiated, like the king of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. He and his wife were initiated there. And Aristotle grew up there. But at the age of 17, he decided to join the academy that Plato had founded in Athens after the death of Socrates. There he stayed for, I think, another 17 years as the brilliant pupil of Plato. He was called the Mind, and he was so intelligent and capable and insightful and so on, that Plato had great admiration for his most incredible pupil, really, in Aristotle. On the death of Plato, Aristotle decided to see more of the world. So he left Athens and he made various wanderings over the area of the islands of Greece and into what we today call Asia Minor. He spent 3 years on an island where he began to study biology. So he's really the first biologist. And he would examine the creatures coming out of the sea and the fish and the plants and so on. And he would begin to see, by taking the lobster and finding the function of every part, how the harmony is there. And he finds a beauty in what many people like Plato were looking for beauty. And here he finds it in this integrated reality of such creatures. He spent 3 years there. It's amazing, the descriptions and the different investigations he makes in that time. He does other travels, and he at one stage goes into one of the states, which that area was called Asia Minor, and it was much ruled by the Persian Empire. They were very influential in that area, and so he stayed there in a place called Assos, and he met the daughter of the ruling chief of that area, who was Greek. He married her, and they went back to live in Greece. But the father was taken by the Persians, horribly tortured and killed. And this had a terrible effect on Aristotle, whose father-in-law had experienced this terrible death. While he was living in Samothrace, he was invited this is after his leaving the Academy of Plato, he was invited by the King Philip of Macedonia to be the tutor of his son, Alexander. And Alexander at that stage was about 16. And this was the beginning of an extraordinary relationship between the philosopher and this conqueror. And we'll see the consequences of that later. Well, he eventually came back to found his own academy, the Lyceum. And it was very different from the Academy of Plato. It was a kind of research center. It was the first library constructed in Europe. They read books and studied literature of other thinkers and so on. So its task was to enhance the thinking so that one could begin to understand the world that surrounds us. And whereas Plato had looked for the ideas that regulate the world in a hidden world that you have to penetrate through exercise, Aristotle rather found it in the examination of the plants and the animals and so on, and the human being, that there is the idea. The idea is embedded in the objects of the sense world. It's not visible, but it's there. So every plant has its own idea. And he even uses a different word, eidos, which is often translated also as the form. So there is a kind of form principle in Aristotle, which is quite different from the form principle in Plato. Plato looks back, for example, all learning for Plato is a remembering. And he gives a wonderful illustration of that in one of his dialogues. We come with a knowing, and learning is just remembering what we've experienced pre-birth. An extraordinary idea. And he illustrates it, Plato. And Aristotle, in his discussions, which are all written down, he challenges this. And he says, no, we find the idea in our researches into the world that surrounds us. So he's orientated towards future research, whereas Plato is more orientated to contemplative research, which enriches us from the past. His way of delivering his lectures, this is Aristotle, was he walked up and down all the time. And therefore, the word for walking up and down is peripatetic. So often Aristotle's philosophy is called the peripatetic. It's a walking up and down one, which was greatly appreciated by Nietzsche, who loved to walk in the mountains when he was thinking. I've mentioned some of the contrasts that Aristotle, when he challenges Plato. And so he's rejected this idea of pre-birth existence. That's out. Plato is quite clearly in one of the dialogues, The Republic, he describes the souls descending into incarnation. So it was a very clear understanding in the Platonic world, coming out of the mystery centers, that there is a pre-birth reality and our present world is governed by what we experience in that reality. Learning is a remembering of that world. Now, ideas for Plato are quite separate from the world that we look at. So if we look at a horse, the idea of the horse includes every horse. So it's quite a separate entity from the physical object that we might look at. But of course, for Aristotle, the idea and the object are in some way united. The world of change is open for our inspection. The truth of a thought is like a perception. And when you see it, you know it. And that's very much interesting to compare with our modern concept of evidential proof. Steiner makes quite a thing of this, that for the Greeks, thinking is not, in our sense, a very introspective process. It's a kind of seeing. So that even with Socrates, when he's going around challenging people what is justice, he wants them eventually to see it. You don't enter into an introspective process, which is more a modern approach, and where you come to, I understand it. So and still in Aristotle, you have this understanding is a kind of perception. And that, I think, is a very important thing, which is beginning to change when you come to a figure after the birth of Christianity, like St. Augustine. Here is Aristotle's understanding of the organic world. I'll be very brief. All living characters have souls. Plants have growth. They are vegetative souls, nutritive souls. That's what they are. They grow and they are nourished. That's it. But animals have senses as well. They also have growth and are nutritive, but in addition, they sense the world. Plants don't have what he would call senses. Human beings, in addition to having growth and nutrition, have also the senses and perception, but they also have desires. That's interesting. He puts it like that. They have desires. Only human beings have desires. You could say, well, a dog desires to eat that bone or whatever, but that's not in the sense that Aristotle uses desires, because the human being can desire this or desire that. But no dog will say, shall I eat that bone or chase that cat? It's already engaged by what the perceptions bring to do. The other important thing in the nature of the human soul is it has a history. No animal really has a history. And if dogs have a history, it's really the history of the dog with the owner. So no animal has truly a history. That resounds. I've been reading Pasternak, whom I think is one of the great writers, and he says somewhere, people who live without history are like dogs who die in a ditch. I'll go on. So that's just a outline of his picture of the world we look at with its different stages of mineral, plant, animal, human. Now, in his book, which usually given a Latin name, De Anima, concerning the soul, he considered that the soul is separate from the body. Now, it's interesting how he comes to this conclusion. I'll try to make it clear. He says there's matter and there's form. Well, matter we never see. Hule is invisible. We only see it actualized when it takes form. So a crystal, the form, the actual material there is totally invisible to us, but the form it takes, it makes it actual. Every object has matter, which I don't see. You can say it's at all atoms and molecules, if you like, in a modern way of looking at it. I don't see anything of the matter, but I see the form. And the form is imposed on the matter and it becomes actual. But when you come to the soul, there is no hule, there is no matter. So there is only the substance is just form. Therefore, the soul is separate from the material objects. Now, you may not be persuaded, but it's interesting how one wrestles with that problem of the essential difference between the material in our existence and the reality. Still a problem today. Francis Crick said everything is atoms and molecules. If you think it's all culture and all that stuff, you're living in illusions. If you come to Wellington Waterloo Station, there's a huge building next there called Crick. Francis Crick, who was the great discovery of DNA. So for him, the real world is not the world we look at. However, that's aside. So the sense world is where things are actualized. Now, a plant becomes real in its evolution. It produces little seed leaves, and then it grows and produces blossoms, and then the blossoms produce the fruit, and in that way it realizes itself. So it realizes itself in this movement from seed to fruit. You can say it grows towards its completion. So it put a plant and seed in, it shows itself, and it's growing towards its completion. And he calls that word the end of the purpose of the growth of the plant, entelechy. That is its entelechy, to fruit, and then, of course, it goes through a new cycle. So the entelechy of the rose bush is the producing of the rose seed at the end, the rose bud. Not the flower, but the next stage. And similarly with all the vegetables. So that word entelechy is a key word in Aristotle. And he looks at the world and asks himself, what is the end of this? So if you take a plant, the end of the plant is the fruit. The end of the apple tree is the apple, and so on. And so he turns that question to everything. What is the end of the human being? Everything has a telos, that's end. This is what modern philosophy utterly denies, scientific philosophy utterly denies that there's any end, that there's any, don't use the word purpose because that's not quite the same. It's going towards something. There's a movement in a gesture, in a finalization. And he asks the question, well, what's the telos of the human being? We'll come to that later. So when he looks at the world teleologically, he does it in an interesting way. Now, you know, cause, you can't think of anything uncaused, can you? If somebody said, oh, it happened, but there's no cause, no, that's not possible. So everything has a cause. And then he looks at the nature of cause, and he gives you an example. For example, a man decides to make a sculpture of an athlete, whatever. So he has that. But the first cause, what he calls the material cause, is he must have something to work on. It could be wood, it could be marble, it could be whatever. But nothing can happen unless you've got the first cause. And then the second cause is to know how that's organized. You can do with marble what you can't do with wood and vice versa. So you have to know the organization of the material you're working with, how it's related with. Is it durable? Is it permanent? Is it like always changing? Whatever. And then the third cause is you need somebody to do it. And he calls that the efficient cause. So you need a sculptor. And then the fourth cause is the final cause, the statue of the athlete. Notice the final cause is already there at the beginning as well. But he calls it the final cause because it's not complete until the sculpture is standing there and people can look at it. So there are four causes: the material, the formal, the efficient, and the final. And you can apply that to various things in life, even building a car. What are the materials you need? Aluminium, rubber, copper, all sorts of things. You need to know where they're organized, what copper does and what rubber does and so on. And then you need, that's your formal cause, and then you need people to do it. Even if they're using robots, people have invented the robots, and then finally Vauxhall. It's interesting to see how this man begins to try and get a hold of our relationship to the world around us. For example, he gives the final cause of exercise. Now, I'm sure some of you do exercise. Well, the final cause is health. Final cause of study would be understanding the stars or whatever. We can enter into it in not exactly an analytic way, but in seeing the conditions that surround the intentions that we have. And the other thing, it's pretty obvious, I think, but you see, when he looks at cause, he's not looking at some transcendental thing that enters into reality. He's seeing it's already there in the reality he's trying to understand. It's embedded in the world. Aristotle's totally trying to enter a transcendental world. That is a world that is outside us and that we have to enter into. Aristotle is exploring a world that is embedded in the visible world, but we have to work in order to make it visible. One of the books that's most read was De Anima. The other one is his book on ethics. Now, ethics for us means understanding the right behavior, what rules do you follow maybe, what is beneficial for the people involved, or all sorts of thou shalt and thou shalt not and so on. And there's none of that in the ethics of either Plato or Aristotle. They are looking at the whole situation of a human being in society. And they're wanting to understand how are we embedded in our whole society. That gives us our understanding of the ethical world. And it penetrates into education, it goes into politics, so it's wide-ranging. And it's not just the narrow prescriptive ethics that we talk about often, and that often we are quite lost in. So it's not about obeying a law, but it's the whole domain of social life, the goals and the kind of character they call for. It's not prescriptive, and there's no thou shalt not. Aristotle considers education principles as a part of political science. Let me try and summarize some thoughts in this area. The object of human striving for Aristotle is the good. That's what we are striving for, the good. And he identifies this as happiness. And that seems interesting. Hence, what is happiness? To find out, Aristotle turns to the notion of the function or activity of the human being. What is the function of a human being? For him, the function of the human being is to bring to expression what lives in the soul. What comes to expression, that is the function of the activity of man. So a person with musical gifts wants to bring that out into expression. And similarly, in the moral life, we have something in us which we want to bring out into expression, whether it's to help my neighbor or to contribute to a charity or whatever. But it's something that lives in me that looks for expression. That's our function. The function is the expression of the nature of the soul. So we all have souls of a different nature, and each one of us will want to bring that into expression in our own way. But it's not that everyone has their own morality, because we're all common human beings. So we all have a common morality, actually, in front of us. And that is the realization of what is expressed, what's expression from the soul. The function is the expression of the nature of the soul, which is translated into the activity of the soul in accordance with its appropriate virtue or excellence. So each one of us will have a different level of excellence or virtue, and that will govern the kind of thing that we bring into expression. He's not doing any analysis of human beings, but he's leaving the situation open to encompass the whole diversity of human experience without making it just individualistic. Virtue is analyzed as a state of character concerning with choosing the mean in action or feelings. Now he gives examples of this, and I'll give you these. What is a mean? M-E-A-N. This is explained by the principle which a man of practical wisdom will determine it. It's not an arithmetic mean, like what's the mean between 6 and 12 or whatever. What does this mean? Basically, the fixed character of the soul is the striving towards the good. It's not a transcendent good. Ethics deals with the human being in action. So it's not the obedience to some set of rules that have been given by the Quran or the Moses or whatever. It's the human being in action. And he, out of his practical sense, has to make judgments. So, for example, in the question of, he says, first of all, that good is not individual. We have, as I've said, we have a common nature. The human good requires an all-life scope. Now that's interesting, because it means that you can't just be good for that thing. You're good with your children, but you're terrible with your husband. That's not what he's talking about. It's what is this comprehensive engagement with life in the direction of the good, once you have given you a picture of what the good is. It requires this total commitment in some way that's part of your whole life. It's not just part of a bit of your life. He's not talking about good health or pleasures for the body and so on. He's saying that external goods are necessary often for arriving at the good, But bodily situations is not important for this. And now he comes to describe what he means by the good. He says, possible goals, which people would say, this is the good, are pleasure. I just want to have a good time in some way. People would say in collecting stamps, some would say in walking the mountains, whatever. That's pleasure. That's my good. And I would give it to everybody else. But there are people who want honor, to be honored, to be looked up to be respected. And that's a very important ingredient for many people, maybe not today so much, but in some ways it's a possible goal of and conception of what the good is. Success, I'm successful in business, I'm successful in research, I'm successful in novels I write, and so on. And the final choice is, I'm interested in the task of contemplation. So that's another possible expression of the good. How one should fashion one's life depends on the raw materials we have. What he calls the raw materials. It's rather like a craftsman. You can't do something if you haven't got the materials. So if you have no musical gifts, you can't play the violin or whatever. And so we have to look and see what our possibilities are, what we can do, and out of that, we strive towards our good. But he doesn't condemn any search for the good. He's not out to judge people. He's out to show what is the reality. And people, in that sense, make for themselves different goods. And there's also no striving towards a kind of Superman. If you all do this, you will be Nietzsche's Superman or whatever. There's nothing like that. If you do follow this training, you will become a clairvoyant and a fantastic individual and so on. That's not in Aristotle. Fundamentally, it's based on the fact that reason is a gift of the human being and a unique gift. Our virtue is not, we don't bring it with us. It's not inborn. It represents a state of characters which we have acquired through practice. The virtuous must act from knowledge, choose their actions for their own sake, and these must issue from a firm and unchangeable character. I'll come to explain what he means by the mean. He says, we all stand between excess and deficiency. And he imagines that, for example, you're going into the struggles of everyday life, and there are people who face it with courage, but there are people who are very rash, and they have an excess of courage, so they do rash things. And whereas the purely courageous person faces what is and gives it the appropriate response. Now, the rash people go too much. They're in excess. And the other people are timid. So the true way forward for us is to search for the mean, the middle way, not the excess, not the deficiency. And he turns that attention to liberality. It's good to be liberal, but it's not good to be prodigal, give away the fortune like Tolstoy maybe. It's not good to be that, and it's not good to be miserly, but to be liberal. What the situation requires, and what you're able to do, and what the person would understand, and so on. And then temperance, he talks about temperance, that's modesty. In how one lives, if you're temperate, that's fine. But if you drink too much wine and get drunk regularly, that's in excess. And if you're abstinent and you say, no, I never touch wine, then that's, for Aristotle, that was deficient. The Greeks always mixed their wine with water. So they felt that drinking wine solid was maybe too in excess. This is from Aristotle, I'm reading it. Aristotle wrote, anyone can get angry, and easily, and give and spend money. But to do this to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, with the right purpose, and in the right manner, is not something that anyone can do, nor is it easy. That is why good conduct is rare, praiseworthy, and noble. One of the tasks that Aristotle set himself was to look at how states were governed. Now, you must realize that in the Greek of Plato's time, cities were self-governing. There was no united Greece. They were united by language and by belief in the gods, by their culture, the habitual games that took place every 4 years, and so on. But they were often at daggers drawn with each other over various disputes. And so Athens and Sparta were the two of the most prominent of these city-states. So when Aristotle studies the states, he's looking at the governments of these city-states like Sparta and Athens and others, and also the barbarian states. And he examined 150 constitutions to come to the conclusion, how do human beings govern themselves? And he had knowledge of the barbarian world, and he writes that out, and he goes through some of these, and he analyzes them into about 5 different kinds of constitution. These 5 different ones, they're often put into modern terms, but if I'm reading what it says in the politics, they're not quite similar to what we have today, like, well, I won't go into that, but his one, the 5 that he talks about, which is observed in these 150, more or less come into these 5 categories. There's a kingship like they had in ancient Greece when Agamemnon was the ruler of the Greek army that went to destroy Troy. And he was king and general and decided everything. And he also was important in the whole religious rites that they carried out. So that's a kind of a king with supervision of the religious life as well, and possibly also a general, and maybe even a hereditary. That's one form. It has more or less disappeared in the Greeks because the original king in the Greeks, the Basileus, was actually pushed aside, and he still was accepted, but he was of no significance. He only supervised religious cultic questions. And the real leaders, like Pericles and these other famous leaders in Greek history, were generals and real politicians, statesmen. And they were not necessarily chosen by birth, but they came from a certain class and they would be voted for. So the second one was a barbarian, despotic and hereditary, but they had a constitution. So that the Persians, the son would inherit from the father, and he was a religious leader and a military leader, and he had total control. And then you come to an elective tyranny, which happened in Greece with some states. They appointed a man who had total power, but he was elected by the people, and he controlled everything. And another one would be a military ruler elected for life. That also happened in Sparta, particularly, which was a very military state. And then the final one was a very paternalistic state, which had a ruler who really penetrated everything, and he was very admired and looked after. And he said, these are the 5 basic forms that all these 150 states can be seen to fall under. We can't possibly deal with all the things that Aristotle dealt with. Biology, we've spoken about that. The 4 elements, fire, or rather earth, air, water, fire. That's a key construction element in Aristotle's thinking. Logic, the syllogism. I think that starts with Aristotle. If A equals B and C equals B, A must be equal to C. All that kind of thinking. All men are mortal. Socrates was a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's a syllogism. All that kind of penetration of when can a statement be relied upon? And a lot of statements you get out of in politics today, totally illogical. They need Aristotle. He examined drama and his description of drama and what it was. And of course, there are fantastic dramatists in Greece before he was born in the previous century, in the 5th century. But Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides are extraordinary. And he derived certain principles from an examining of the Greek theatre. And these principles continue to be applied in the French court in the 17th century. And then in psychology, well, I've spoken a little about psychology, and it's not our kind of psychology, but it's an attempt to grasp how people are living in the world, and particularly he wanted to understand the nature of mind. Remember, Plato called him the mind. He wanted to understand what is the nature of mind. It's quite interesting, but I could read a very interesting statement he gives in one of his collections of writings called The Metaphysics, on what is the statement of mind, in which he shows that the mind, when it's active, is not contaminated by the body. And that's his word, contaminated. So the mind is active in its free activity, independent of any contribution from how we feel or whatever. That's a very modern arrival at that. And he arrives at it in his own way. So I'll just round off, really, with this question of what is the end for man? And he declared it to be happiness. And he goes into a whole discussion of ethical living with a more detailed description of the achievement of true happiness. He says that pleasure is not a good in itself, since it's by nature incomplete. You know that? You're just looking for that holiday in the Caribbean and sailing, and it's going to be fantastic, and then you're 3 hours in the... And your expectations of pleasure are so vast that you come back and say, okay. But he sees that pleasure is always incomplete. Worthwhile actions are able to give pleasure. So that's a good guideline. If you want to do it, that could be good. So we are rightly guided by our search for pleasure. So it's not a bad thing, but it can be a good guide in our search for the good. It engages us in pleasant rather than in unpleasant. If we do good and regret it and despair about having done it, that's not really a good deed. We have to, genuine happiness lies in action that leads to virtue, since this alone provides true value and not just amusement. Contemplation is the highest form of moral activity because it's continuous, pleasant, self-sufficient, and complete. Final comments in Aristotle's picture of the universe. In this whole picture of change and so on that we were talking about, and causality and so on, he asked the question, if everything has a cause, there must be a prime causa. And he relates that to the deity. So the deity, the God, is the prime mover that starts all causation. And that becomes a central picture in the Catholic view of the world derived from Aristotle. He says, in the picture of the universe, he talks about the concept of change. And since it's quite interesting to reflect in this way, I'll give it to you. He says at the basic, everything changes. That's book form. And the end point is the change. So, in spring, there's change. And the end of the change is the snowdrops and etc. But you ask yourself then, what is the privation? What's the loss? There's a cause or the shortcoming which is overcome by the change. So he says change is discerned by experience. So we can see change in people, in management, in all sorts of areas. We can start looking to say, well, what is this change? Was it change what it was? What was it become? And what was the privation that made it become this? And you can turn that to all aspects of life. So in some ways, he's stirring up very modern questions. And that's experience. It's the people who experience that who can tell you what the substratum is, as he calls it, the original situation, what the privation was, what it was like when it wasn't changed, and so on. You can look at growth, all forms of growth, the change of the seasons, the adolescence becoming an adult, historical movements, the stars and the planets, thought processes, and so on and so on and so on. And all these are embedded in our modern culture, actually. Aristotle is an amazing philosopher. His last statement, the actuality of thinking is life.
The next episode deals with Augustine.